Welcome to the online course on Nibbāna sermons 23 to 33 by Bhikkhu Katakurunda Ñāṇananda, an online course hosted by the Numata Center for Buddhist Studies at the University of Hamburg in collaboration with the Barris Center for Buddhist Studies in Massachusetts. And today we will look at sermon number 30. But before that, a few extracts from the very interesting discussion on the forum. Bhikkhuni Dhammadinna. It is my impression that the Venerable Ñāṇananda takes on Vitakka and Avitakka might be due to his operating with a very clear-cut divide between Samatha and Vipassana, which does not seem to make a lot of room for a more organic development of insight and tranquility as it emerges from the early Buddhist discourses. And B, with the prevalent understanding of Vitakka and Vichara in relation to discursive thought, which does not do full justice to these mental functions in jhana, but also other contexts. And C, under the influence of the Mahasi insight tradition, which I'm simplifying here, aims at slowing down and halting conceptual thoughts by way of the noting technique and of slow motion, in order to give primacy to what is seen as non-conceptual and more primary, thereby enabling the arising of liberating insight and wisdom. Particularly, the third aspect brings to mind a related personal field observation regarding meditators working with the Mahasi and also Goenka, Chan Zen tradition, and some strands of the Thai Force tradition. They may at times tend to see thought as the big culprit. Practitioners influenced by this attitude may at times encounter difficulties in resolving the relationship to thoughts and thinking in a skillful way, in the sense of not being able to navigate very easily the actual reality of the thinking mind, and of distracting thoughts or obsessions by giving more attention to an attempt at putting thoughts aside or suspending them. Yeah, I very much resonated with the last part. In my own experience, it was really crucial to find out, and also when I'm teach to communicate, that meditation is not just about the absence of thought, and that a very powerful cultivation of mindfulness, of insight, of emptiness is precisely when thoughts are present. To be aware of thought without getting carried away by them, without identifying with them, is a very powerful and fruitful arena for meditation practice. Kim Allen. I found the thread in this sermon about pragmatic and relative to be quite beautiful and inspirational. He's describing how we can use concepts to go beyond concepts. The path is, after all, constructed. I suppose we could say there are right kinds of concepts and construction that will lead to the end of such activities. And furthermore, there are right approaches to working with them. We use concepts effectively when we see them as one more thing that is impermanent, stressful, and constructed, and demonstrates the principle of dependent arising. In this way, what in all of experience could not serve as a gate to awakening. Yeah. Robert Grosh. Desire conditions thinking, and thinking or thought conditions desire. Thinking again is also conditioned by papancha sanya sankhara, but thinking also conditions papancha sanya sankhara. So here we have two more whirlpools involving thinking, two more traps of existence. These whirlpools are all connected and contribute to the momentum that binds us to existence. We are in one whirlpool, and before we know what is going on, we are swirled into the neighboring whirlpool and left without orientation. This is what makes radical reflection so difficult. We have to slow down enough and gain the clarity to be able to see what is going on. Yeah, Robert really likes those whirlpools. Hedwig Kren. In meditation, I took up the slightly different rendering of the Venerable of Na etang mama, na esuam asmi, na mesu atta. Not this is mine, not this I am I, not this is myself. It was very interesting to observe that the strong na, not, really has potential to clear the ground from the clinging to the conceit I am. The wording cuts deeper in this way, maybe because of the highlighting of not. The planing down by the reflection not to level all the protuberances was one of the meditative themes that I took with me from this sermon. Yeah, I had the same experience as Hedwig. Uh, this is way back in Sri Lanka when I was transcribing the English translation Venerable Katakananda Ñāṇananda has made of his own sermons. And when I came to this part, this na etang mama, na esam asmi, na meso atta, I also applied it in my own practice, and it gave a real cutting edge to the contemplation of anatta. And lastly, Katrainam. At first glance, formal Satipatthana meditation and silence concentration seem to be quite different practices. Yet upon reflection, their similarity became clearer, at least because the dispassion that can develop with both practices inclines the mind towards letting go. Yeah, I see that also, and I also find this an intriguing aspect. And my personal way of making sense of it is that the Satipatthana meditation described here is particularly said to be Supatitita Citta. It's a better developed, high level of Satipatthana meditation. And if we take that part of the Satipatthana Sutta that I have uh, called a refrain. There's the last part, Anisito cha viharati na cha kinchi loke upadiyati. And this describes really the aim, goal, purpose of the practice, and also a high level of practice. One dwells independently without clinging to anything. And the Animitta has a related nuance. It is can take its starting point in a very basic practice of sense restraint where nimittas are no longer grasped, clung to, and where we no longer dwell dependent on nimittas, and then lead to the actual samadhi, the animitta samadhi, where the mind is still there, is still aware, but no longer operates in the sense of no longer processing information, in the sense of dropping any perception as soon as it arises, and no longer taking up nimittas in any way. And so that anisita, non-dependence, and animitta, signlessness, I like to relate this to each other as two meditative approaches. The second one having a stronger dimension of tranquility, of samadhi, of samatha, but both pointing to the same, to the complete independence, the complete silencelessness of the experience of Nibbāna. Etang santang etang panitang yadidang sabba sankara samato sabbu paripati nisango tanakayo virago nirodo nibbānam. This is peaceful, this is excellent, namely the stilling of all preparations, the relinquishment of all assets, the destruction of craving, detachment, cessation, extinction. With the permission of the assembly of the Venerable Meditative Monks, this is the 30th sermon in the series of sermons on Nibbāna. In our previous sermon, we discussed the way of liberating the mind from the grip of thoughts, which are comparable to the army of Mara, by means of the gradual and systematic mode of practice based on the twin principles of pragmatism and relativity. We also made an attempt to understand why the Arattapala Samadhi of the Arahant, who arrives at the non-prolific state by gradually attenuating cravings, conceits and views, comes to be called Avitaka Samadhi, thoughtless concentration. This Avitaka Samadhi is the noble silence in its highest sense. It is not the temporary subsidence of thinking and pondering as in tranquility meditation. It goes deeper in that it routs the hosts of Mara at their very citadel, as it were, by penetrative wisdom. And the other day, with special reference to the Sakapanya Sutta in the Digha Nikaya, we outlined in brief a path of practice gradually tending towards the cessation of reckonings born of prolific perception. That discourse expounds an happiness, an unhappiness, and an equanimity to be pursued, and a happiness, an unhappiness, and an equanimity not to be pursued. We get a clear enunciation of these two kinds of happiness, unhappiness, and equanimity in the Salayatana Vibhanga Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya. In that discourse, the Buddha gives an exposition of 36 pathways of thought of beings under the heading Chatinsa Santapada, literally 36 steps of beings. They are listed as follows: Chagyasitani Somanasani, 6 kinds of happiness based on the household life. Comment: I just wanted to mention that here the term household life should be taken in a psychological sense. It is not about a distinction between those who have gone forth or not. In other words, even though I wear robes, I might still have Gehasita kinds of happiness or unhappiness. And somebody who is a layperson might have the other type. So it's not about one's role in society, so to say, or outside of society, but it is about the mental attitude. Is it the mental attitude of leading to accumulation of things of ownership, or is it the mental attitude of renunciation? End of comment. Cha Nikkamasitani Somanasani, 6 kinds of happiness based on renunciation. Cha Gyasitani Domanasani, 6 kinds of unhappiness based on the household life. Cha Nikkamasitani Domanasani, 6 kinds of unhappiness based on renunciation. Cha Gehasita Ubekka, 6 kinds of equanimity based on the household life. And Cha Nikkamasita Ubekka, 6 kinds of equanimity based on renunciation. The 6 in each case refers to the 6 objects of sense, namely form, sound, smell, taste, tangible, and idea. Rupa, Saddha, Gandha, Rasa, Pottabha, Dhamma. Now, in order to acquaint ourselves with the 6 kinds of happiness based on the household life, let us try to understand the definition of the first kind, that is to say, form, as the object of the eye. Chakavinyayānaṁ rūpānaṁ itānaṁ kantānaṁ manapānaṁ manoramānaṁ lokāmisa patisaṅyuttānaṁ patilāvaṁ vā patilabato samanupasato pubbe vā patiladda pubbaṁ atītaṁ yaruddhaṁ viparinatāṁ samanusaranto uppajati sumanasaṁ yang iva rūpaṁ sumanasaṁ idam bhuchyate gehasitaṁ sumanasaṁ. When one regards as an acquisition of forms cognizable by the eye that are desirable, charming, agreeable, delightful, connected with worldly gains, or when one recalls what was formerly acquired that has passed, ceased, and changed, happiness arises. Such happiness as this is called happiness based on the household life. Comment translation by Bhikkhu Ñāṇananda. When one regards as a gain the gain of form, cognizable by the eye, that are wished for, desired, agreeable, gratifying, and associated with worldliness, or when one recalls what was formerly obtained that has passed, ceased, and changed, joy arises. Such joy as this is called joy based on the household life, and the Madhyama Agama parallel. The eye comes to know forms that are conducive to joy, and the mind reflects on them, desiring those forms, experiencing happiness conjoined with desire. Those forms which one has not got, one desires to get. Those which one has already got are recollected and give rise to joy. Joy of this type is called joy based on attachment. End of comment. The happiness based on renunciation is defined as follows. Rupanang teva aniccatam viditva viparinama viraga nirodhang pumbe cheva rupa etarai cha sabbe te rupa anicca dukkha viparinama dhammati evametam yatha bhutam samampanyaya passato uppajjati sumanasam yang eva rupang sumanasam idam bhujjati nekama sitam sumanasam. When by knowing the impermanence, change, fading away, and cessation of forms, one sees as it actually is with right wisdom, that forms both formerly and now are all impermanent, suffering, and subject to change, happiness arises. Such happiness as this is called happiness based on renunciation. Comment translation by Bhikkhu Ñāṇananda. When by knowing the impermanence, change, fading away, and cessation of forms, one sees as it actually is with proper wisdom, that forms both formerly and now are all impermanent, suffering, and subject to change, joy arises. Such joy as this is called joy based on renunciation. And the Madhyama Agama parallel. One understands that forms are impermanent, changing, bound to disappear, fade away, and cease. That all forms, both formerly and in the present, are impermanent, dukkha, and bound to cease. Recollecting this gives rise to joy. Joy of this type is called joy based on dispassion. End of comment. Then the unhappiness based on the household life is explained in the following words. Chakvavinyyanang rupanang ittanang kantanang manapanang manorammanang lokami sapati sangyutanang appati labang va appati labato samanupasato pubbeva appati ladda pubbang atitang niruddhang viparinatang samanussarto uppajati domanasam yang eva rupang domanasam idang bujjati gehasitang domanasam. When one regards as a non-acquisition the non-acquisition of forms cognizable by the eye that are desirable, charming, agreeable, delightful, connected with worldly gains, or when one recalls what was formerly not acquired, that has passed, ceased, and changed, unhappiness arises. Such unhappiness as this is called unhappiness based on the household life. Comment translation by Bhikkhu Ñāṇananda. When one regards as a non-gain the non-gain of forms cognizable by the eye that are wished for, desired, agreeable, gratifying, and associated with worldliness, or when one recalls what was formerly not obtained, that has passed, ceased, and changed, grief arises. Such grief as this is called grief based on the household life. And the Madhyama Agama version. The eye comes to know forms that are conducive to joy, and the mind reflects on them, desiring those forms, experiencing happiness conjoined with desire. Those forms which one has not yet got, one is not able to get. Those which one has already got are soon past and gone, scattered and decayed, having ceased or changed, which gives rise to sadness. Sadness of this type is called sadness based on attachment. Here the Madhyama Agama version is a little different. Whereas the Pali is about what one earlier did not get, the Madhyama Agama is about what one got but what has changed and disappeared. Both instances are sadness based on attachment or the household life. End of comment. The description of unhappiness based on renunciation has a special significance to insight meditation. It runs, Rupanang teva aniccatam viditva viparinama viraga nirodhang pupecheva rupa etarahai cha sabbe te rupa anicca dukkha viparinama dhammati evametam yatha bhutang sammapanyaya disva anuttaresu vimukhesu piyeng upattapeti kadasu namahang tattayatanang upasampajya vyarisami yad arya itarahai ayatanang upasampajya vyarantiti. Iti anuttareso vimokeso piyam upatapayato uppajjati piya pacchayata domanasam. Yang eva rupang domanasam idang mochati nekkamasitam domanasam. When by knowing the impermanence, change, fading away, and cessation of forms, one sees, as it actually is with right wisdom, that forms both formerly and now are all impermanent, suffering, and subject to change. One arouses a longing for the supreme deliverances. Thus, when shall I enter upon and abide in that sphere that the noble ones now enter upon and abide in? In one who arouses such a longing for the supreme deliverances, unhappiness arises, conditioned by that longing. Such unhappiness as this is called unhappiness based on renunciation. Comment, translation by Bhikkhu Ñāṇananda. When by knowing the impermanence, change, fading away, and cessation of forms, one sees, as it actually is with proper wisdom, that forms both formerly and now are all impermanent, suffering, and subject to change. One generates a longing for the supreme liberations. Thus, when shall I enter upon and abide in that base that the noble ones now enter upon and abide in? In one who generates thus a longing for the supreme liberations, grief arises with that longing as condition. Such grief as this is called grief based on renunciation. And the Madhyama Agama, one understands that forms are impermanent, changing, bound to disappear, to fade away and cease. That all forms, both formerly and in the present, are impermanent, dukkha, and bound to cease. Recollecting this, one reflects, when will I attain and dwell in that sphere, namely the sphere that the noble ones attain and dwell in? This is one's aspiration for the highest liberation. The frightening knowledge of dukkha and sadness gives rise to sadness. Sadness of this type is called sadness based on dispassion. End of comment. The description of unhappiness based on renunciation brings up some important terms worth discussing. Anuttaresu Vimokesu is a reference to the three supreme deliverances, knowing as Animitta, the signless, Apampanita, the undirected, and Sunyata, the void. The reference to an ayatana sphere in this passage is particularly noteworthy. The sphere that the noble ones enter on and abide in is none other than the sphere alluded to in the famous sutta on Nibbāna in Ñāṇananda, beginning with Adi Bhikkhave Tattayatanam Yattha Nivapatavina Apo, etc. Monks, there is that sphere in which there is neither earth nor water, etc. We have pointed out that this is a reference to the cessation of the six sense spheres as a realization. So the sphere that the noble ones enter on and abide in is the very cessation of the six sense spheres. In the same sutta passage in Ñāṇananda, we came across the three terms appatittang, appavattang, and annāramanam, unestablished, the non-continuing, and the objectless, which we identified as allusions to the three deliverances. The word piya, Sanskrit sriha, longing, desire, occurring in this context, shows that there need not be any hesitation in using words implying desire in connection with Nibbāna. It is true that such a desire or longing for Nibbāna makes one unhappy, but that unhappiness is preferable to the unhappiness based on the household life. That is why it is upgraded here as unhappiness based on renunciation. Comment. Yeah, I thought this is a very important comment the Venerable Ñāṇananda makes. There's sometimes this tendency of thinking that any kind of desire is just wrong, and this is clearly not an accurate reflection of early Buddhist thought, where there is a distinction between types of desire, and desire, even longing, for liberation, for freedom, for purification of the mind are commendable because they lead one onwards on the path that eventually will end up bringing about complete absence of desires. End of comment. So far, we have quoted instances of the six kinds of happiness based on the household life, Chāki, Hasitani, Somanasani. Six kinds of happiness based on renunciation, Cha, Nekkhamma, Sitani, Domana, Somanasani. 6 kinds of happiness based on the household life, Chagya Sitani Domanasani, and 6 kinds of unhappiness based on renunciation, Chanekama Sitani Domanasani. The 6 in each case refers to the objects of the 6 senses. Now let us take up a paradigm to understand the 6 kinds of equanimity based on the household life, Chagya Sita Upekka. Chakuno rupang disva upajati upekka balasya molasya prujanasya no dojinasya avipakajinas anadinavadasavino asuttavato prujanasya ya eva rupa upekka rupang sa na ativatati tasmasa upekka gyasitati uchati. On seeing a form with the eye, equanimity arises in a foolish, infatuated worldling, in an untaught worldling who has not conquered his limitations, who has not conquered the results of karma, and who is not aware of danger. Such equanimity as this does not transcend form. That is why it is called equanimity based on the household life. Comment translation by Bhikkhu Ñāṇananda. On seeing a form with the eye, equanimity arises in a foolish, infatuated, ordinary person, in an untaught, ordinary person who has not conquered his limitations or conquered the results of action, and who is blind to danger. Such equanimity as this does not transcend the form. That is why it is called equanimity based on the household life. And the Madhyama Agama. The eye comes to know forms, and there arises equanimity. That is the indifference of one who is not learned, who lacks wisdom, an unlearned, ignorant worldling. Such equanimity towards form is not detached from form. This is called equanimity based on attachment. End of comment. The equanimity of a worldling untaught in the Dharma, who has not conquered limitations and defilements, and who has not conquered the results of karma, is incapable of transcending form. His equanimity is accompanied by ignorance. Then comes the description of equanimity based on renunciation, nekkamasita upekka. Rupanang tveva nityatang viditva viparinama viraga nirodang puppe cheva rupa etaraicha sabbete rupa anicca dukkha viparinama dhammati evametang yatha bhutang sammabhanyaya passato upajyati upekka. Ya eva rupa upekka rupang sa ativatati tasmasa upekka nekkamasitati uchati. When, by knowing the impermanence, change, fading away, and cessation of forms, one sees as it actually is with right wisdom, that forms both formerly and now are all impermanent, suffering, and subject to change, equanimity arises. Such equanimity as this transcends form. That is why it is called equanimity based on renunciation. Comment translation by Bhikkhu Ñāṇananda. When by knowing the impermanence, change, fading away, and cessation of forms, one sees as it actually is with proper wisdom, that forms both formerly and now are all impermanent, suffering, and subject to change, equanimity arises. Such equanimity as this transcends the form. That is why it is called equanimity based on renunciation. And the Madhyama Agama version. One understands that forms are impermanent, changing, bound to disappear and to fade away and cease. That all forms, both formerly and in the present, are impermanent, dukkha, and bound to cease. Recollecting this, one is established in equanimity, equanimity that has been attained through mental development. This is called equanimity based on dispassion. Yeah, I particularly like in the Madhyama Agama that reference to equanimity attained through mental development. End of comment. The same kind of reflection on impermanence upon occasion gives rise to happiness, unhappiness, and equanimity according to the attitude taken up. Unlike the equanimity born of ignorance, this equanimity born of right wisdom transcends form. That is why it is called equanimity based on renunciation. The Buddha speaks about all the 36 objects of sense, out of which we brought up as a paradigm the illustration given about the visual object, form. These 36 are called 36 pathways of beings, chanting Sasattapada. in the sense that they depict the thought patterns of beings. In this discourse, the Buddha proclaims the basic maxim he employs in gradually channeling the thought processes of beings towards Nibbāna along these 36 pathways. The maxim is summed up in the following words: Tatra idang nisaya idang pajahata. Therein, depending on this, abandon that. This maxim has some affinity to the Paticca Samuppada formula, this being, this arises. In fact, this is a practical application of the same formula. In the context of the path of practice, the dependence on one thing is for the purpose of abandoning another. There is an attitude of detachment in this course of practice. Based on this maxim, the Buddha outlines the way in which he guides one towards Nibbāna in 4 stages. The first stage in that gradual path towards Nibbāna is described as follows. Tatra bhikkhave yani cha nekkamasitani somanasani tani nisaya tani agama yani cha gehasitani somanasani tani pajahata tani samatikkamata evametasang pahanam hoti evametasang samatikkamam hoti. Then monks die depending on and relying on the 6 kinds of happiness based on renunciation, abandon and transcend the 6 kinds of happiness based on the household life. That is how they are abandoned, that is how they are transcended. Comment? Translation by Bhikkhu Ñāṇamoli. Here, because by depending and relying on the 6 kinds of joy based on renunciation, abandon and surmount the 6 kinds of joy based on the household life. It is thus they are abandoned, it is thus they are surmounted. And the Majjhima Agama. By holding to the 6 types of joy that are based on dispassion, by depending on them and dwelling in them, extinguish the 6 types of joy that are based on attachment, remove them, vomit them out. In this way they are to be eradicated. End of comment. In the same way, by depending on the 6 kinds of unhappiness based on renunciation, the 6 kinds of unhappiness based on the household life are abandoned. Also, by depending on the 6 kinds of equanimity based on renunciation, the 6 kinds of equanimity based on the household life are abandoned. So at the end of the first stage, what are we left with? All what is based on the household life is left behind, and only the 6 kinds of happiness based on renunciation, the 6 kinds of unhappiness based on renunciation, and the 6 kinds of equanimity based on renunciation remain. That is the position at the end of the first stage. Then in the second stage, a subtler and more refined level of experience is aimed at. Out of the 3 types of mental states based on renunciation, firstly, the 6 kinds of unhappiness based on renunciation are abandoned by the 6 kinds of happiness based on renunciation. Then the 6 kinds of happiness based on renunciation are abandoned by the 6 kinds of equanimity based on renunciation. To the extent that all the above 3 mental states are based on renunciation, they are of a piece with each other. Also, it is the same mode of insightful reflection that gives rise to them. However, as attitudes, happiness is subtler and more excellent than unhappiness, and equanimity is subtler and more excellent than happiness, since it is nearer to wisdom. So in the second stage, we see a gradual procedure arriving at a subtler and more excellent state, even in the case of those 3 mental states based on renunciation. By the end of the second stage, only equanimity based on renunciation remains. Now comes the third stage. Here the Buddha points out that in the case of equanimity, there can be 2 varieties. Ati bhikkhave ubekka nananda nanattasita, ati bhikkhave ubekka ekatta ekattasita. There is monks an equanimity that is diversified based on diversity, and there is an equanimity that is unified based on unity. Comment translation by Bhikkhu Ñāṇamoli. There is Bhikkhu's equanimity that is diversified based on diversity, and there is equanimity that is unified based on unity. And the Majjhima Agama. There is equanimity that is of countless contacts, diverse contacts, and there is equanimity that is of a single contact, not of diverse contacts. End of comment. What is that equanimity that is diversified? It is defined as the equanimity regarding the objects of the five external senses. That is to say, equanimity regarding forms, sounds, smells, flavors, and tangibles. Equanimity that is unified is defined with reference to the immaterial realms, namely the sphere of infinity of space, the sphere of infinity of consciousness, the sphere of nothingness, and the sphere of neither perception nor non-perception. Now, in the case of these two types of equanimity, the Buddha points out the way of abandoning the equanimity based on diversity with the help of the equanimity based on unity. As equanimity, both types are commendable, but that which is diversified and based on diversity is grosser. Equanimity that is unified and based on unity is subtler and more excellent. So the equanimity based on diversity is abundant and transcended by the equanimity that is unified based on unity. This is the end of the third stage. In the fourth stage, we are left with only that equanimity that is based on unity. It is experienced in the higher rungs of meditation. But here too the Buddha advocates a prudent course of action. In fact, it is here that the deepest practical hint is given. Attammayatang bhikkhave nisaya, attammayatang agamma, yayang upekkai kattai katasita, tang pajata tang samatikkamata. Evam etis pahanang hoti, evam etis samatikkama hoti. Monks, by depending and relying on non-identification, abandon and transcend equanimity that is unified based on unity. That is how it is abandoned, that is how it is transcended. Comment translation by Bhikkhu Ñāṇananda. Because by depending and relying on non-identification, abandon and surmount equanimity that is unified based on unity. It is thus this is abundant, it is thus this is surmounted. End of comment. Not yet end of comment actually. I need to mention that this part is not found in the Majjhima Agama. No, really, end of comment. Attamayata is a term we have already discussed at length in our earlier sermons. Its importance has not been sufficiently recognized in our tradition. As we pointed out, the word tammayam, literally of thatness, could be explained with reference to such usages as suvarnamaya and rajatamaya, gold and silver. How does this of thatness come by? If, for instance, one who has attained the infinity of space as a meditative experience identifies himself with it, with the conceit, Iswam Asmi, this am I, there is that tammayata coming in. It is a subtle grasping, or in other words, a me thinking, manjana, imagining oneself to be one with that experience. So the Buddha's advice is to abandon and transcend even that equanimity based on unity by resorting to the maxim of attammayata, non-identification. The subtle conceit asmi, is that trace of grasping with which one tries to sit pretty on that which is impermanent and changing. It is the most fundamental assertion of existence. In the Sappurisa Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya, we get a good illustration of the application of this principle of detachment made known by the Buddha. Sappurisu chako bhikkhave iti parisanchikkati. Neva sanya na sanya yatana samapatiya bhikkhu attammayata buddho bhagavata. Yena yena himanyanti tatutang hoti anyata. So attammayatang yeva antarang karitva thaya neva sanya na sanya yatana samapatiya neva attan unkang sirina parang bambeti. Ayambi bhikkhave sampurisa dhammo. But a good man, monks, considers thus non-identification even with the attainment of the sphere of neither perception nor non-perception has been declared by the fortunate one, in such terms as, in whatever way they imagine, thereby it turns otherwise. So he takes into account that very non-identification and neither exalts himself nor disparages another, because of his attainment of the sphere of neither perception nor non-perception. This too, monks, is the nature of a good man. Comment, translation by Bhikkhu Ñāṇananda. But the true man considers thus non-identification, even with the attainment of the base of neither perception nor non-perception, has been declared by the Blessed One. For in whatever way they conceive, the fact is ever other than that. So putting non-identification first, he neither lauds himself nor disparages others because of his attainment of the base of neither perception nor non-perception. This too is the character of a true man. And the Madhyama Agama, one who has the nature of a true person, reflects like this. The Blessed One has said that the sphere of neither perception nor non-perception is of an immeasurable type. However, if one were to measure it, then that would be clinging. Because of this absence of clinging, he should receive support and respect. If, advancing in this way, he attains the true Dharma without praising himself or looking down on others, then this is the nature of a true person. End of comment. In the Sappurisa Sutta, the Buddha expounds the characteristics of a good man. In this context, the term Sappurisa, good man, is used exclusively to represent a noble disciple, Arya Savaka. A noble disciple does not look upon his jhanic attainments in the same way as an ordinary meditator attaining jhanas. His point of view is different. This discourse explains this viewpoint. A good man reflects wisely according to the advice given by the Buddha, to the effect that even to the higher jhanic attainment of neither perception nor non-perception, the principle of non-identification must be applied. Recalling the maxim made known by the Buddha, yena yena imanyati tattutam hoti anyata. In whatever way they imagine, thereby it turns otherwise. This is a maxim we had discussed earlier too. Manyana is egoistic imagining. When one thinks in egoistic terms about something, by that very me thinking, it turns otherwise. Due to egoistic imagining, it becomes a thing. And once it becomes a thing, it is bound to change and become another. The good man calls to mind that maxim, that norm, and refrains from exalting himself and disparaging others on account of his attainment. He does not identify himself with it. From this it becomes clear that Attamaya or non-identification is the path to Nibbāna. So the Buddha gradually channelizes the pathways of thoughts of beings from the grosser to subtler levels, and finally tops up by directing them to Nibbāna through non-identification, Attamaya. Non-identification is the watchword for clinging free Parinibbāna. The dictum tatra idang nisaya idang pajahata, then depending on this, abandon this, which the Buddha expounds in the Salayatana Vibhanga Sutta, portrays the duality between attention, manasikara, and inattention, amanasikara. That is to say, the basic principle in this dictum is the method of encouraging inattention to grosser things by recommending a way of attending to subtler things. So it seems that both attention and inattention are given an importance in this procedure. In order to eliminate one thing by inattention, attention to some other thing is recommended. For the purpose of inattention to something gross, attention to something subtle is taken up. But that is not the end of it. Even that is expelled with the help of something subtler. Here we have a wonderful technique based on the two principles of pragmatism and relativity. These two terms comprehend the entire gamut of the path of practice in Buddhism. Pragmatism means for some practical purpose, relative means in relation to something else. That is, as a means to an end, and not absolutely as an end in itself. So in this system of practice, everything has a pragmatic and a relative value. The question of attention and inattention has also to be understood in that background. A clear illustration of the method of elimination of grosser mental states with the help of subtler mental states by attention and inattention comes in the Vitakka Santana Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya. There the Buddha explains this method, making use of a simile of a carpenter. Seyatapi bhikkhave dakko palagandova palagandante vasiva Sukumaya aniya ularikang ani abhinihanei abhiniharei abhinivanjai. Evameva ko bhikkhave bhikkhuno yang nimittang agamma yang nimittang manasikaroto upampanjanti papaka akusala vitakka chandupasangitapi dosupasangitapi mohupasangitapi tena bhikkhave bhikkhuna tamma nimitta anyang nimittang manasikatamma kusalupasangitang. And just as monks, a skilled carpenter or his apprentice might knock out, draw out, and remove a coarse speck by means of a fine one, even so monks, when a monk finds that due to some sign, by attending to some sign, there arise in him evil, unskillful thoughts connected with desire, with hate, and with delusion, that monks should attend to some other sign in its stead, one that has to do with the skillful. Comment translation by Bhikkhu Ñāṇananda. Just as a skilled carpenter or his apprentice might knock out, remove, and extract a coarse peg by means of a finer one, so too when a bhikkhu is giving attention to some sign, and owing to that sign there arise in him evil, unwholesome thoughts connected with desire, with hate, and with delusion, then he should give attention to some other sign connected with what is wholesome. And the Majjhima Agama? It is just as a carpenter or a carpenter's apprentice might apply an inked string to a piece of wood to mark a straight line, and then trim the wood with the sharp aids to make it straight. In the same way, because the sign has led to the rising of unwholesome thoughts, the monk instead attends to a different sign related to what is wholesome, so that evil and unwholesome thoughts will no longer rise. Yeah, the Majjhima Agama has quite a different simile here. And I must say I find the Pali version similarly more fitting to the context. End of comment. Now let us try to understand the point of this simile. When, for instance, a carpenter, in fitting out a door, finds that he is driving a blunt nail, he extracts it with the help of a sharper one. He takes up the sharper nail just for the purpose of extracting the blunt nail. So also one resorts to a skillful thought to expel the unskillful thought as a means to an end. This kind of pragmatic and relative approach avoids tenacious grasping and dogmatic involvement. The spirit of the law of dependent arising runs through the entire course of Buddhist practice, culminating in atammayata, non-identification. The two terms kusala and akusala also deserve our special attention in this context. The basic meaning of kusala is skillful and akusala means unskillful. Here again we have something relative. Skillful presupposes unskillful and gets a value in relation to the latter. It has no absolute value. We make use of the skillful in order to push away the unskillful. That done, there is no further involvement with it, as one's last resort is atammayata, non-identification. That is why there is no problem of a clogging coming in. This is again, I found this a very important comment by Venerable Ñāṇananda, as particularly in our Theravada tradition, there is sometimes a very understandable emphasis on the importance of what is kusala, skillful or wholesome, but the aspect of atammayata, non-identification, is not seen with sufficient clarity. There's this beautiful passage, I think it's in Samana Mandika Sutta, Sila vahoi nocha sila mayo, be virtuous but not made of virtue. I think that very powerfully brings out that same thing that one observes morality, one does what is skillful, but one does not construe a sense of identification, attachment, and conceit based on that. End of comment. Our discussion of the Salayatana Vibhanga Sutta brings to light another unique feature of this Dhamma. In other religious systems, the question of reality is resolved by having recourse to unity. Oneness is supposed to be the ultimate goal. In our analysis of the samsaric problem, we often refer to a duality or dichotomy. Everywhere we were confronted with a duality, but to grasp the two as one in some form of oneness is not the way out. Instead, we have here as the final solution atammayata or non-identification, a clinging-free approach in the last analysis. Comment, yeah, I cannot help again expressing my appreciation for this point. There's a considerable trajectory in among Buddhist practitioners to miss out on the need of non-identification even with the idea or the experience of unity. Unity is indeed not the final solution for the problem of duality. The final solution is attammayata. End of comment. It is in the nature of samsaric existence that beings find themselves bound and fettered. These fetters are called sangyojanani. A binding over a fetter implies two, as when two bulls are tied together. The term upadana is also quite often used. It implies a holding on to something. There too the notion of a duality comes in, one who holds and the thing held. It is not at all easy to transcend this duality, characteristic of samsaric existence. This is the crux of the whole problem. Unity or oneness is not the solution. It has to be solved with extreme judiciousness. In the very first discourse of the Samyutta Nikaya, we get a solution to the problem, briefly stated. The discourse is called Oga Tarana Sutta, crossing the flood, and it was given pride of place, probably because of its importance. A deity comes and asks the Buddha, Katang no tvang marisa ogang atari? How did you, sir, cross the flood? And the Buddha answers, Apatitang kvang avusu anayuhang ogang atari. Without tarrying, friend, and without hurrying, did I cross the flood. But the deity, finding the answer too enigmatic, asks, Yathakatang panatamang marisa apatitang anayuhang ogang atari? But how exactly is it, sir, that you crossed the flood without tarrying and without hurrying? Then the Buddha makes an explanatory statement. Yadasvang avoso santitami tadasu sangsidami. Yadasvang avoso ayuhami tadasu nibboyhami. Evam kvang avoso apatitang anayuhang ogangattaring. When I, friend, tarried, I found myself sinking. When I, friend, hurried, I got swept away. And so, friend, without tarrying and without hurrying, did I cross the flood. Comment translation by Bhikkhu Bodhi. When I came to a standstill, friend, then I sank. But when I struggled, then I got swept away. It is in this way, friend, that by not halting and by not straining, I crossed the flood. And here again the Samyukta Agama parallel, which conveys basically the same sense. End of comment. Then the deity, being pleased, uttered the following verse in approbation. Chirasang vatapasami brahmanang parinimmutam apatitang anayuham tinnang loke visantikam. Oh, what length of time since I beheld a saint with all his passions quelled, who neither tarrying nor yet hurrying has crossed the world's viscosity, craving. Comment translation by Bhikkhu Bodhi. After a long time at last I see a Brahmin who is fully quenched, who by not halting, not straining, has crossed over attachment to the world. And here the Samyukta Agama parallel again giving pretty much the same meaning. End of comment. This discourse on crossing the flood reveals some salient features of the middle path. If a person caught up in a water current tries to stay still, he will sink. If he simply struggles to escape, he will get swept away. So, like a good swimmer, he has to avoid both extremes and by means of a mindful and systematic gradual thought, work out his freedom. In other words, he has to strive, not struggle. So we can understand why the Buddha in his very first sermon, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, Discourse on the Turning of the Wheel of Dhamma, proclaimed as the middle path, the Noble Eightfold Path, avoiding both extremes of attachment to sensuality, Kamasukkalikanuyoga, and self-modification, Attakilimattanuyoga. Here too the implication is that the entire round of existence is a water current to be crossed over by means of a systematic and gradual effort. In some of our earlier sermons, while analyzing the law of dependent arising, we made use of the simile of the vortex for easy comprehension. Now, if we are to take it up again, we may say that it is in the nature of beings in samsara to get drifted by the current of preparations, sankhara, owing to ignorance, avidya, and go on revolving between consciousness, vijnana, and name and form, nama-rupa. This ignorance in the form of the four great perceptions, namely the perception of permanence in the impermanent, the perception of pleasure in the painful, the perception of beauty in the repulsive, and the perception of self in the not-self, give rise to the runaway current of water which keeps running round and round between consciousness and name and form. This is the samsaric vortex, samsaravatta. Now, for instance, if we throw even a small leaf to a spot where there is a vortex, it also keeps revolving. Similarly, all over this samsaric existence, duality holds sway. Therefore, freedom from it can be won only by a subtle form of striving. That is why the Buddha used the two terms apatittang and Anālayo. Avoiding the two extremes of stagnation and struggling, one has to cross the flood, going the middle way. When the Buddha proclaimed that freedom can be won only by the middle way, avoiding both extremes, the extremist philosophers of his day criticized and disparaged him, saying, "Then you are preaching a doctrine of bewilderment." We find such an instance of accusation in the Māgandiya Sutta of the Atthakavagga of the Sutta Nibbāna. The Brahmin Māgandiya poses the following question to the Buddha. Ajata santiyeti yametamattang katang udhire paviditang tang. That which they call inward peace, in what terms have the wise proclaimed that peace? Comment translation by Bhikkhu Bodhi. As to that matter called the peace within, how is it proclaimed by the wise? End of comment. The Buddha's answer took the following form. Naditya na sutya na jnanena silabate napi visuddhimahu. Aditya sutya anyana asilata abbata nopitena. Edechani sajja anuggahaya santo anisaya bhavang na jappe. Not by views, nor by learning, nor by knowledge, nor yet by virtue and holy vows, they say, can purity come. Neither can it come by being without views, learning and knowledge, without virtue and holy vows, letting go of them all, grasping not one, that peaceful one, leaning on none, would hanker no more for existence. Comment translation by Bhikkhu Bodhi. Not by view, nor by knowledge, nor by learning, nor do I speak of purity through good behavior and observances. But neither without view, without learning, without knowledge, without good behavior, without observances, not in that way. But having relinquished these, not grasping any of them, peaceful, not dependent, one should not hanker for existence. End of comment. At this, the Brahmin Māgandiya was puzzled and accuses the Buddha of prevarication. No chikira diddhiya na sutiya na jnanena silabate napi visuddhimaha aditya sutya anyana asilata abbata nopitena manyamahang momuhameva dhammam ditya ege panchadi suddhi. If not by views, nor by learning, nor by knowledge, nor yet by virtue and holy vows can purity be won, if it comes not without views, learning and knowledge, without virtue and holy vows, well then bewilderment itself, I think, is this Dhamma. For there are some who claim purity by views. Comment translation by Bhikkhu Bodhi. If indeed it is not by view, by learning, nor by knowledge, nor by good behavior and observances that one speaks of purity, No, without view, without learning, without knowledge, without good behavior and observances, not in that way. I think this is an utterly confused teaching. Some fall back on purity by means of view. End of comment. Now these two verses call for some comments. Firstly, there's a minor problem about variant readings. In both these verses, we follow the reading Visuddhi, whereas some editions accept the reading Na Suddhi, where the negative seems superfluous. Visuddhi seems more meaningful here. The commentary explanation of these two verses seems to go off at a tangent. It says that the negatives in the first two lines of the Buddha's reply refer to wrong views, wrong learning, wrong knowledge, wrong virtue, and wrong vows. And at the third and fourth line refer to right view, right learning, right knowledge, right virtue, and right vows. In other words, it is only a question of wrong views, micchaditthi, and right view, sammaditthi. This interpretation misses the subtle point at issue in this dialogue. If it is as simple as that, there is no ground for Markandeya's accusation. Other religious teachers who disputed with each other and used to assert that purity is attained only by their views, learning, knowledge, virtue, and vows. Here then it is not a question of difference between Micchaditthi and Sammaditthi. Here is something more radical concerning Sammaditthi itself. According to this enlightened approach, views etc. cannot totally be dispensed with, nor are they to be grasped. We come back now to the two keywords, pragmatic and relative. That is why the Buddha declared that purity cannot be attained by views, learning, knowledge, virtue, and vows, nor in the absence of these qualities. This is an apparently contradictory statement, which, however, puts in a nutshell the essence of the middle path. The inward peace mentioned in the above context is nothing other than the clinging free perfect extinction, anupada parinibbāna. That becomes clear by the last three lines of the Buddha's reply, Eticha nisajja anuggahaya santo anisaya bhavangna chappe. Letting go of them all, grasping not one, that peaceful one leaning on none, would hanker no more for existence. Common translation by Bhikkhu Bodhi, but having relinquished these, not grasping any of them, peaceful, not dependent, one should not hanker for existence. End of comment. We came across the word anisita in our discussions about Nibbāna. For instance, in the cryptic formula Nisitasa Chalitang, Anisitasa Chalitang Nandi. To the one attached, there's wavering. To the unattached one, there's no wavering. Being unattached, there's no hankering for existence. When there's grasping, there's existence. We may revert to our simile of sharpening a razor. The constituents of the path have to be taken up as one takes up a razor for sharpening, ready to let go. Once the purpose is served, they have to be given up. That is the dictum underlying this dialogue in the Markandeya Sutta. Now we come to a discourse which clearly and unmistakably presents this extraordinary first principle. The discourse is the Ratavinita Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya. Here it is not a case of arguing with the Brahmin. The interlocutors in this discourse are two stalwarts of this dispensation, namely Venerable Sariputta and Venerable Punnamanthaniputta. Their long discussion on the path of practice, unfolding itself in dialogue form, was not meant for any clarification of doubts for themselves. It was probably inspired by a benevolent wish to help others, to those Markandeyas in the world who are ignorant of the pragmatic nature and relative value of the Buddha's middle path. For easy comprehension, we present this discourse in three parts. First of all, Venerable Sariputta poses the following question to Venerable Punnamanthaniputta. Kingnukoa vuso sila visuddhatang bhagavati brahmacharyang vusatiti. What friend is it for the sake of purification of virtue that the holy life is lived under the fortunate one? And Venerable Punnamanthaniputta replies, no friend. Then is it for the sake of purification of mind that the holy life is lived under the Fortunate One? No, friend. Then is it for the sake of purification of view, purification by overcoming doubt, purification by knowledge and vision of what is the path and what is not the path, purification by knowledge and vision of the way, purification by knowledge and vision that the holy life is lived under the Fortunate One? No, friend. Then Venerable Sariputta asked, for the sake of what then, friend, is the holy life lived under the Fortunate One? Friend, it is for the sake of perfect Nibbāna without clinging that the holy life is lived under the Fortunate One. Comment translation by Ñāṇananda. But friend, it is for the sake of purification of virtue that the holy life is lived under the Blessed One? No, friend. Then it is for the sake of purification of mind, purification of view, purification by overcoming doubt, purification by knowledge and vision of what is the path and what is not the path, purification by knowledge and vision of the way, purification by knowledge and vision that the holy life is lived under the Blessed One? No, friend. For the sake of what then, friend, is the holy life lived under the Blessed One? And the Madhyama Agama. Are you practicing the holy life under the renunciant Gautama for the sake of purification of mind, for the sake of purification of view, for the sake of purification from the hindrance of doubt, for the sake of purification by knowledge and vision of what is the path and what is not the path, for the sake of purification by knowledge and vision of the way, for the sake of purification by knowledge of the way to abandoning? To each question, Punnamantani Buddha replied, not so. In that case, for the sake of what are you practicing the holy life under the renunciant Gautama? Yeah, before continuing, I wanted to discuss a little bit the beginning of this discussion. In the Majjhima Nikaya version, the first question Sariputta asks is, Bhagavati no avusa brahmacharyam vusateti. Is the holy life lived under the Blessed One, friend? Which is a kind of a strange question to ask for a Buddhist monk, to ask another Buddhist monk. And now if we look at the Madhyama Agama parallel, he asks whether the holy life is cultivated under the recluse Gautama. And this is actually the way the Sariputta keeps referring to the Buddha in the Madhyama Agama version. And we find this is actually supported by some Sanskrit fragments. Have survived only very few small pieces of the Sanskrit version. But it is clear that here too he uses Shramana, and the next we get Gautama. And we find another line where the expression Bhagavan is used. So it is clear that there is also here an exchange of question answer where one person uses Shramana Gautama and the other one Bhagavan. And if we look at this from the viewpoint of oral transmission, in the reading Shramana Gautama, recluse Gautama is the more unusual reading. And so if that should have been found in the Pali version at some earlier point, it would have been very easy for it to get corrected, so to say, during oral transmission, because the reciters would have been aware of the fact that it is quite inappropriate for Sariputta to refer to his teacher, the Buddha, as recluse Gautama. Now, if we take a step back and look at the whole situation, the setting of this discussion is that at an earlier point, Sariputta had heard Punnamantani Buddha being praised in the presence of the Buddha. And at that time he thought like, oh, I hope I will be able to meet this Punnamantani Buddha and have a discussion with him in the future. And then at a later time, Punnamantani Buddha actually comes to visit the Buddha. And another monk tells Sariputta, look, this Punnamantani Buddha has come. You always wanted to discuss with him. That is your occasion now. And so then Sariputta goes to meet Punnamantani Buddha, and The whole idea seems to be that he wants to tease out Punnamanthaniputta's wisdom. And in fact, at the end of the discussion, Punna says, when Sariputta then reveals his identity at the end of the discussion, Punna says, wow, if I had known that that was Sariputta I'm talking to, I would have never gone into such a detailed explanation. So, because Sariputta was very famous for his wisdom, it was important for him not to give away his identity too early, because he would not have been able to tease out such a powerful and detailed explanation from Punnamantaniputta. And so, in this setting, for Sariputta to avoid even being asked his name, which Punna might have done if he had realized that he's talking to another Buddhist monk, it actually makes a lot of sense for Sariputta to pretend not to be a Buddhist. And here, again, as a background, the discourse, of course, we don't know exactly when to place this Rattavinita Sutta in the overall history of early Buddhism, but Ananda is not mentioned. And so this makes it possible that this discourse should be located at an earlier time when Ananda had not yet become the Buddha's attendant. And we find in the Vinaya an episode where the Buddha asks Ananda to devise a way of sewing robes so that they resemble the pattern of paddy fields. And this episode is found in the different Vinayas, and some of them give as introductory narration that a contemporary king had been paying respects to some ascetics, mistaking them for Buddhist monks. So the idea seems to be that the Buddha gives this instruction to Ananda to develop a certain way of making robes so that Buddhist monks, Buddhist monastics, nuns also, become more easily recognizable. From the viewpoint of that episode, it would seem that at an earlier time, before the Buddha gave this instruction to Ananda, Buddhist monastics were not easily recognizable. If that should hold for the Rattavinita Sutta, it would mean that Sariputta was not, Punna had never met him before. Sariputta's robes would presumably have been of the type generally used in ancient India by recluses and not distinctly Buddhist. And by using Shramana Gotama, Samana Gotama, he would also not give himself away as a Buddhist. It would mean that he is able to tease out and motivate Punna to give this detailed explanation by, in a way, without, of course, lying in any way, but just by pretending to be a non Buddhist. And that now going, it's a little bit a long story, but it's not just about this discourse, because if this whole reconstruction should be somewhere close to what the text is about, it would in turn have considerable implications on the 7 stages of purification. Because these 7 stages of purification are only found in this one discourse, and they are part of a set of 9 purification, where the term used is parisuddhi instead of visuddhi. In the Dasuttara Sutta, the last discourse of the Digha Nikaya, a long list of doctrinal items. Otherwise, they don't occur in the early discourses. They are an element of rather secondary importance. If Sariputta was pretending or playing the part of being a non-Buddhist, he would of course not have been able to formulate his questions with some teaching that is typically Buddhist. Means that my impression is that these stages of purification, maybe not the complete set of 7, but individual of them, were ideas generally floating in the ancient Indian setting. In fact, we earlier had the passage from Magandiya Sutta where he asserts Ditya eke pachanti suding, some here get purity through views. So that's very clear, the purification by views, and purification by morality is obvious. And so my impression, my argument, my hypothesis, my suggestion is that the 7 stages of purification were not a distinctly Buddhist teaching, not even central in early Buddhism, but they are an assembly of different ideas of what the goal of living the holy life, the celibate life might be: purity of morality, purity of views, etc. And they're strung together here in a series in the context of Sariputta playing the part of a non-Buddhist and wanting to see how Punnamataniputta handles the question whether the holy life, the celibate life, the life of practice under the Buddha is for the purpose of any one of these. I still haven't finished. Another aspect that is now interesting also is that the very fact that the 7 stages of purification are found only in this one discourse seems to have had an important impact on Buddhaghosa's use. Buddhaghosa in his Visuddhimagga uses the 7 stages of purification as his basic scaffolding. And this is how the 7 stages of purification have become of paradigmatic importance in the Theravada tradition. Now, Buddhaghosa seems to have had another work as his precedent. This is the Vimuttimagga, work that nowadays is only extant in Chinese. It's shorter, it's somewhat more practical, and it does not have the 7 stages of purification. It only refers to some of them in a kind of by the way manner. And so, from as far as I can see, when Buddhaghosa was given this task of was having to prove his abilities so that he will be entrusted with the task of retranslating the commentaries now extant, at that time extant in Sinhala, into Pali as part of this overall project of promoting the Mahavihara in its competition with the Abhayagiri. These 2 monasteries were in competition with each other in Sri Lanka, and the Abhayagiri was the one more open to and interested in general developments in Buddhism in India, and the Mahavihara was the more conservative one. And this whole project was to strengthen the conservative position of the Mahavihara. And within that context, Buddhaghosa writes the Visuddhimagga, and he takes apparently his inspiration from the Vimuttimagga, that he kind of tried to do better than the Vimuttimagga in a way, to be more comprehensive by using the 7 stages of purification. However, in doing so, he made a major blunder. The 7 stages of purification do not include the final goal. Even in the simile, the 7 chariots, they only lead the king Pasenadi to Saketa, but then he still has to get off the last chariot and get into the palace. And though the 7th purification is just knowledge and vision, Ñāṇadassana, and in the 9-fold scheme, it is only that we get Vimutti Visuddhi, Vimutti Parisuddhi, liberation, as a purification. And Buddhaghosa apparently seems to have missed out on this aspect, because he puts the 4 paths and the 4 fruits, the 4 levels of awakening, under the 7th purification. This does not square with the implication of the 7th purification. So he seems to have made a blunder there. And this, again, is only understandable because he is such an erudite monk, that because of the fact that the 7 purifications were, until his time, not really a central element in Buddhist thought. And it is only through the Visuddhimagga that they become so central. So that was a very long comment, and as you might suspect, I'm also giving one of my articles on this topic as the reading for this lecture. End of comment now. So the ensemble of part 1 of the dialogue is that the holy life is not lived under the fortunate one for the sake of any of those purifications, but for something called Anupada Parinibbāna, perfect Nibbāna without clinging. Now, in what we would call part 2 of the dialogue, Venerable Sariputta highlights the contradictions in the answers given so far, somewhat like Magandiya. Apparently, there is some need for clarification. He asks, but friend, is purification of virtue perfect Nibbāna without clinging? No, friend. In this way, he asks whether any of the other stages of purification, up to and including purification by knowledge and vision, is perfect Nibbāna without clinging. Venerable Punna answers in the negative. Then Venerable Sariputta asks, Kim panavosa anyatra me dhamme anupada parinibbāna? But friend, is perfect Nibbāna without clinging to be attained without these states? No, friend. So then it looks as if the trend of contradiction has come to a head. Now in part 3 of the dialogue we find Venerable Sariputta rhetorically summing up the previous section of the dialogue. When asked, but friend, is purification of virtue perfect Nibbāna without clinging? You replied, no, friend, and so on, citing even the last negative response. And when asked, but friend, is perfect Nibbāna without clinging to be attained without these states? You replied, no, friend. And rounds up by asking with apparent exasperation, Yata katang panavose massa bhasitassa attodatabbo. How then, friend, can one understand the meaning of this statement? So, rather dramatically, the stage is now set for Venerable Punnamattaniputta to come out with the deepest point in the discussion. Sila visuddhinchavusa bhagavano pada parinibbānang paññapessan, saupadanang eva samanang anupada parinibbānang paññapessan. Friend, if the fortunate one had designated purification of virtue as perfect Nibbāna without clinging, he would have designated what is still accompanied by clinging as perfect Nibbāna without clinging. Comment translation by Ñāṇamoni. Friend, if the Blessed One had described purification of virtue as final Nibbāna without clinging, he would have described what is still accompanied by clinging as final Nibbāna without clinging. Enter Madhyama Agama. Venerable friend, if the Blessed One, the renunciate Gautama, were to designate Nibbāna without remainder for the sake of purification of virtue, then that would be to praise what is without remainder of clinging as being without a remainder. Then it would be to praise what is with a remainder of clinging as being without a remainder of clinging. End of comment. In the same strain, he goes on to apply this criterion to the other stages of purification and finally brings out the absurdity of the other extreme in the following words. Anyatta chiya vose me dhamme anupada parinibbānang abhavissa putujjano parinibbayaya putujjano hi avosa anyatra me dhamme. And if, friend, perfect Nibbāna without clinging were to be attained without these states, then even an ordinary worldling would have attained perfect Nibbāna without clinging. For an ordinary worldling, friend, is without these states. Comment. Translation by Bhikkhu Ñāṇamoli. And if Nibbāna without clinging were to be attained without these states, then an ordinary person would have attained final Nibbāna. For an ordinary person is without these states. And the Madhyama Agama. Venerable friend, if the world honored one were to designate Nirvana without remainder apart from these things, then a worldling should also have attained Nirvana without remainder, because a worldling is also apart from these things. Yeah, I find this particular passage interesting because sometimes we get claims of people having realized emptiness or whatever, who have never done any kind of practice, not even morality or anything else. And I find this very helpful as a pointer that there needs to be some degree of practice, some purification of morality, of view, and of the mind as a precondition for the realization of Nibbāna. It does not happen just out of nothing without any kind of preparation. End of comment. Now we can see how subtle this question is. Simply because it was said that none of the above states is perfect Nibbāna without clinging, they cannot be dispensed with. We have already discussed the significance of the Alagadupama Sutta in this concern. There we came across two similes, the simile of the raft and the simile of the water snake. To carry the raft on one's shoulder after crossing is one extreme. To take the water snake by its tail is the other extreme. The middle path lies between these two extremes. And that is the implication of the above statement that if perfect Nibbāna without clinging is attained without these states, then even an ordinary worldling would have attained it, for he has none of them. For further clarification of this point, Venerable Punnamantaniputra comes out with the simile of the relay of chariots. King Pasenadi of Kosala, while living in Savatthi, has some urgent business to settle at Saketa. Between Savatthi and Saketa, 7 relay chariots are kept ready for him. The king mounts the first relay chariot, and by means of it arrives at the second relay chariot. Then he dismounts from the first relay chariot and mounts the second chariot. By means of the second chariot, he arrives at the third chariot. In this way, finally arrives at Saketa by means of the 7th chariot. Then, with his friends and relatives in Saketa, ask him, "Sire, did you come from Savatthi to Saketa by means of this chariot?" He cannot reply in the affirmative. He has to relate the whole story of passing from chariot to chariot. Having given this simile as an illustration, Venerable Punnamantaniputra sums up the correct solution to the point at issue in the following memorable words. Evameva ko avoso sila visuddhiya vadeva citta visuddhata, citta visuddhiya vadeva ditti visuddhata, ditti visuddhiya vadeva kanka vitarana visuddhata, kanka vitarana visuddhiya vadeva magga maganyana dasana visuddhata, magga maganyana dasana visuddhiya vadeva patipada jnana dasana visuddhata, patipada jnana dasana visuddhiya vadeva jnana dasana visuddhata, jnana dasana visuddhiya vadeva anupada parinibbanata, anupada parinibbanatan ko avuso bhagavati brahmacharyam vusati. Even so, friend, purification of view is purposeful as far as purification of the mind. Purification of the mind is purposeful as far as purification of view. Purification of view is purposeful as far as purification by overcoming doubt. Purification by overcoming doubt is purposeful as far as purification by knowledge and vision of what is the path and what is not the path. Purification by knowledge and vision of what is the path and what is not the path is purposeful as far as purification by knowledge and vision of the way. Purification by knowledge and vision of the way is purposeful as far as purification by knowledge and vision. Purification by knowledge and vision is purposeful as far as perfect Nibbāna without clinging. It is for perfect Nibbāna without clinging that the holy life is lived under the fortune moon. Comment translation by Bhikkhu Ñāṇamoli. So too, friend, purification of virtue is for the sake of reaching purification of mind. Purification of mind is for the sake of reaching purification of view. Purification of view is for the sake of reaching purification by overcoming doubt. Purification by overcoming doubt is for the sake of reaching purification by knowledge and vision of what is the path and what is not the path. Purification by knowledge and vision of what is the path and what is not the path is for the sake of reaching purification by knowledge and vision of the way. Purification by knowledge and vision of the way is for the sake of reaching purification by knowledge and vision. Purification by knowledge and vision is for the sake of reaching final Nibbāna without clinging. It is for the sake of final Nibbāna without clinging that the holy life is lived under the Blessed One. And the Madhyama Agama. In the same way, venerable friend, through purification of virtue, one attains purification of mind. Through purification of mind, one attains purification of view. Through purification of view, one attains purification from the hindrance of doubt. Through purification from the hindrance of doubt, one attains purification by knowledge and vision of what is the path and what is not the path. Through purification by knowledge and vision of what is the path and what is not the path, one attains purification by knowledge and vision of the pathway. Through purification by knowledge and vision of the way, one attains purification by knowledge of the way to abandoning. Through purification by knowledge of the way to abandoning, the Blessed One designates Nibbāna without remainder. End of comment. The key word in this grand final of this dramatic exposition is Yāvadeva. Simply rendered, it means just for, that is, the sufficing condition for something else. Properly understood, it is the watchword upholding the twin principles of pragmatism and relativity. In the light of the illustration by relay chariots, this watchword stands for that impersonal momentum or impetus required for any gradual course of purposive action, according to the law of dependent arising. So we see how the Buddha discovered and laid bare the first principles of a universal law conducive to one's emancipation. Here is a series of states, in which one state is to be made use of for reaching another, and that for reaching yet another, but none of which is to be grasped per se. This is the distinction between what is called upadi, or samsaric asset, and nirupadi, or the assetless Nibbāna. In the case of those meritorious deeds productive of samsaric assets, one goes on accumulating and amassing them. But for the Nibbānic state of nirupadi, the assetless, there's a different approach. One state leads up to another, and that to yet another, in accordance with the simile of the relayed chariots. But none of them is to be grasped per se. One grasps neither purification of view, nor purification of the mind, nor purification of view, nay, even purification by knowledge and vision. Leaving them all behind and reaching the subtles of them all, there comes the final let go, to attain that perfect extinction without clinging, anupada parinibbāna. This is the subtlest truth in this Dhamma. Thank you for your attention.